On January 6, 2026, at the Canadian Embassy in Paris, something unusual happened. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood next to Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and said this: "The future of Greenland will be decided solely by the people of Denmark and Greenland." If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. Not a diplomatic hedge. Not a carefully worded suggestion for dialogue. A direct statement that Canada supports Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland, said publicly while Donald Trump was actively threatening to annex the territory by military force. According to the Canadian press, Carney emphasized basic principles of self-determination, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Then he announced Canada is opening a consulate in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, and sending both the Foreign Affairs Minister and the Governor-General there in February. This matters because it represents a NATO ally explicitly choosing another NATO ally's position over the United States on territorial sovereignty. And it's not happening in isolation. Stay with me. The full context of what just unfolded in Arctic diplomacy is more significant than the headlines suggest. Let's establish the timeline with documented facts. Trump appointed Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry as special envoy to Greenland in late December 2025. Landry stated on social media his job was to make Greenland a part of the U.S. On January 5, 2026, Danish Prime Minister Frederiksen warned that a U.S. takeover of Greenland would spell the end of NATO. The next day, on January 6, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stated that acquiring Greenland was a national security priority, and that utilizing the U.S. military is always an option at the Commander-in-Chief's disposal. That same day, Carney met privately with Frederiksen in Paris. They were both there for a coalition of the willing meeting on Ukraine security guarantees, but they used the opportunity to coordinate on Arctic policy. After their meeting, Carney emphasized Canada's support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Denmark, including Greenland, which must be respected in accordance with international law. He announced specific actions. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand and Governor-General Mary Simon would travel to Greenland in early February to open Canada's consulate in Nuuk. Also on January 6, 7 European leaders issued a joint statement on Greenland. The leaders of France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, the United Kingdom, and Denmark signed it. The statement was direct. Greenland belongs to its people. It is for Denmark and Greenland, and them only, to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland. The statement emphasized that security in the Arctic must be achieved collectively, in conjunction with NATO allies including the United States, by upholding principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the inviolability of borders. Separately, the Nordic foreign ministers of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden issued their own joint statement reiterating that matters concerning Denmark and Greenland are for Denmark and Greenland to decide alone. These are the facts as documented by official government readouts, press conferences, and major news organizations. No speculation, no interpretation yet. Just what happened. Drop a comment if you've seen other examples of NATO allies publicly contradicting U.S. foreign policy positions this directly. For decades, Arctic geopolitics operated on implicit understandings that maintained regional stability. The United States was the dominant power, its military and economic influence underpinning security arrangements across the polar region. Canada and Denmark coordinated closely with American leadership on matters of regional security, intelligence sharing, and strategic planning. When disagreements arose, as they inevitably did over territorial boundaries, resource extraction rights, or military positioning, they were handled through established diplomatic channels, not inflammatory public statements or threats. This system wasn't perfect, but it functioned because all parties understood the rules of engagement and respected the sovereignty of their allies. What fundamentally changed the calculus is that President Trump publicly stated that military force was an option for acquiring Greenland, a territory of Denmark, which is a founding member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This wasn't merely a rhetorical flourish or negotiating tactic that could be dismissed as typical Trump bombast. Under the North Atlantic Treaty, Article 5 explicitly states that an armed attack against one NATO member shall be considered an attack against all members, and each ally will assist the attacked party with such action as deemed necessary, including the use of armed force. This collective defense clause is the very foundation upon which NATO has maintained peace in the North Atlantic region for over 75 years. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen's subsequent warning that U.S. military action against Greenland would effectively end NATO was not hyperbole or an overreaction. It was based squarely on this foundational principle. If the United States, NATO's most powerful member and the architect of the alliance, were to use military force against the territory of another member state, it would render Article 5 meaningless. How could Denmark or any other NATO member trust in collective defense if the very nation expected to lead that defense is the aggressor? The alliance would collapse not through formal dissolution but through the complete erosion of the trust and mutual commitment that makes collective security possible. When Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney used the phrase, "solely by the people of Denmark and Greenland," during his response, he was doing far more than offering diplomatic pleasantries. He was directly and unequivocally rejecting any claim that the United States has a legitimate say in determining Greenland's political status or future. This represented a significant departure from Canada's typically cautious approach to contradicting American positions on matters of strategic importance. When Carney emphasized the principles of self-determination of nations, sovereignty, territorial integrity, he was articulating values enshrined in the United Nations Charter and contradicting the position that Greenland's future could or should be determined by American strategic interests, regardless of how compelling those interests might be from a U.S. perspective. Perhaps most significantly, when Carney announced that Canada is opening a consulate in Nuuk with a cabinet-level delegation to oversee the process, he was taking concrete diplomatic action that materially supports Denmark's position while Trump is actively threatening annexation. This wasn't merely symbolic solidarity, it was a tangible demonstration that Canada views Greenland as having sufficient international standing to warrant direct diplomatic representation, and that Canada is willing to invest political capital and resources into strengthening its relationship with Greenland independent of U.S. approval or coordination. Daniel Bieland, a political science professor at McGill University who specializes in comparative public policy and political institutions, told ABC News that it's vital for Canada to stand firmly for international law and against what he characterized as Trump-style bullying and aggression. Bieland's framing reflects a broader concern among international relations scholars that the rules-based international order, painstakingly constructed over decades following World War II, is being eroded by great powers who view military and economic might as justification for disregarding sovereignty when convenient. The line that was crossed is this. A sitting U.S. president openly threatened military action to acquire territory from a NATO ally, and other NATO allies responded by publicly rejecting that position and coordinating diplomatic responses that explicitly exclude American leadership from decision-making processes. This represents a fundamental breakdown in the alliance structure that has underpinned Western security for three-quarters of a century. Whether this rupture can be repaired, or whether it represents a permanent realignment of how democratic allies interact with an increasingly unpredictable United States, remains to be seen. Hit that like button if you think sovereignty rules should apply equally to all nations, regardless of their military power. This isn't the first time Trump has made territorial claims that challenged international norms, but the Allied response this time represents a fundamental departure from previous patterns of diplomatic engagement. During Trump's first presidency in August 2019, he publicly floated the idea of the United States purchasing Greenland from Denmark, characterizing it as essentially a large real estate deal that would serve American strategic interests in the Arctic region. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen politely but firmly declined, calling the proposal absurd, which prompted Trump to cancel a scheduled state visit to Denmark. After several weeks of diplomatic tension and media coverage, Trump eventually dropped the idea, and the issue faded from international headlines without lasting damage to U.S.-Danish relations or the broader NATO alliance structure. The difference now is the explicit military threat that accompanied the renewed territorial ambitions. The White House didn't merely suggest a purchase or negotiation. Officials specifically stated that military force was an option for acquiring Greenland, fundamentally changing the nature of the discussion from economic transaction to potential armed aggression. This statement didn't occur in a vacuum. It came immediately after controversial U.S. military operations in Venezuela that resulted in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro, demonstrating that the Trump administration was willing to use military force to achieve foreign policy objectives in the Western Hemisphere. The proximity of these events signaled to European allies that threats regarding Greenland should be taken seriously rather than dismissed as rhetorical excess. The European response is also dramatically different from 2019. Instead of diplomatic silence, carefully worded individual statements, or vague platitudes about the importance of dialogue and maintaining strong transatlantic relations, 7 NATO allies, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Netherlands, Norway and Sweden, published a coordinated joint statement on the same day. This level of public coordination among European NATO members in direct contradiction to a U.S. position is virtually unprecedented in the alliance's history. The statement didn't employ the usual diplomatic euphemisms or coded language that allows for multiple interpretations. Instead, it explicitly affirmed that borders cannot be moved by force, and that sovereignty and territorial integrity are fundamental principles, making clear that these nations viewed Trump's threats as violations of core international law principles that they would not tacitly accept through silence. Canada's response is particularly notable not just for its substance but for the symbolism of who they're sending to Greenland to represent Canadian interests. Mary Simon is Canada's first Indigenous Governor-General, a historic appointment that recognized the contributions and perspectives of Canada's First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. Prior to becoming Governor-General, Simon previously served as Canada's ambassador to Denmark from 1999 to 2001 and as ambassador for Circumpolar Affairs, roles in which she built extensive networks and deep expertise in Arctic diplomacy and Indigenous rights. Her selection to lead the delegation for the consulate opening wasn't random. It represented a carefully considered diplomatic message. Greenland's population is approximately 56,000 people, the overwhelming majority of whom are Inuit or of mixed Inuit and European heritage. The Greenlandic Inuit share cultural, linguistic, and historical connections with Inuit peoples across the Arctic, including the approximately 65,000 Inuit who live in northern Canada. By sending an Inuk Governor-General to open the consulate, Canada is signaling recognition of these Indigenous connections across Arctic territories and positioning itself as understanding Greenland's situation from a perspective that goes beyond geopolitical strategy to include cultural affinity and shared experience. This approach stands in stark contrast to the Trump administration's framing of Greenland primarily as a strategic asset valuable for its resources and military positioning. There's also significant meaning in the timing of Canada's announcement. The Canadian government had originally planned to open the consulate in Nuuk in November 2025, with preparations beginning months earlier. However, the opening was delayed due to severe weather conditions that made construction and staffing logistics impossible during Greenland's harsh winter months. The plans for establishing a diplomatic presence in Greenland weren't created in response to Trump's threats. They reflected Canada's long-term strategic assessment of the Arctic's growing geopolitical importance. However, Prime Minister Carney's public announcement of the February opening, the elevation of the mission to include a cabinet-level delegation, and the pointed language about sovereignty and self-determination were clearly positioned as a direct response to current events and Trump's territorial ambitions. These aren't isolated reactions from individual nations pursuing separate foreign policy objectives. They represent a coordinated diplomatic strategy among NATO allies to establish clear, public boundaries around the principle of territorial sovereignty and to signal that threats against one member will be met with collective diplomatic opposition. Whether this coordination extends to contingency planning for more serious scenarios, such as actual military moves toward Greenland, remains unknown to the public, but the unprecedented nature of the joint statement suggests that Allied conversations are occurring at levels far beyond what's visible in public diplomacy. Let me know in the comments whether you think this is a pattern of Allied coordination or separate national responses. The immediate consequence of Trump's territorial threats is diplomatic isolation on a scale rarely seen for the United States within the NATO alliance. The joint statement from 7 European leaders, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden, carefully described the U.S. as an essential partner, while simultaneously emphasizing that Arctic security must be achieved collectively while upholding the fundamental principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. This diplomatic language represents a delicate balancing act. These nations need to maintain their security relationship with the United States while drawing an unmistakable red line around behavior they consider unacceptable. That phrasing is diplomatically significant precisely because of what it accomplishes. It acknowledges American importance to European security and Arctic defense without conceding that this importance grants the United States special privileges to override fundamental principles of international law. The statement effectively says that American partnership is valued, but partnership doesn't mean acquiescence to territorial aggression, even from an ally. This represents a more assertive European stance than has typically characterized transatlantic relations, where European nations have often muted criticism of American actions to preserve the broader alliance. Marion Messmer, director of the International Security Program at London's Chatham House think tank, questioned the entire premise of the administration's position by asking why Washington needs full control over Greenland to defend itself. Messmer noted that the United States already maintains Patuxent Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base, in northwestern Greenland, which serves as a critical installation for missile defense, space surveillance and early warning systems. The base provides everything the United States ostensibly needs from Greenland: radar capabilities to detect ballistic missiles, satellite tracking infrastructure, and strategic positioning to monitor Russian and potentially Chinese activities in the Arctic. If security is truly the objective, the existing arrangement already accomplishes American defense goals without requiring annexation or control over Greenlandic territory. This skepticism about the stated rationale isn't limited to foreign analysts. U.S. Representatives Steny Hoyer, a Democrat from Maryland, and Blake Moore, a Republican from Utah, serve as co-chairs of the bipartisan Congressional Friends of Denmark caucus. These members of Congress issued a joint statement calling the annexation talk needlessly dangerous, and explicitly noting that the United States already has access to everything it needs from Greenland through existing agreements with Denmark. The fact that bipartisan members of Congress felt compelled to publicly contradict the White House position demonstrates how Trump's threats have created divisions not just internationally but within American political institutions that typically present a united front on foreign policy matters. The longer-term consequence extends far beyond the immediate diplomatic friction. It's fundamentally about trust and the reliability of American commitments to foundational alliance principles. Professor Daniel Beeland from McGill University noted that Canada has a particularly strong incentive to stand firmly for international law, partly because Canada is itself a major Arctic country and Greenland is Canada's closest neighbor across the Davis Strait and Baffin Bay. Canadian leaders understand that what happens to Greenland could establish precedents that affect Canadian interests directly. If the United States is willing to threaten military action against Denmark over Greenland based on strategic interests, Canada has to seriously consider the implications for Canadian Arctic sovereignty. The Northwest Passage, the sea route through the Canadian Arctic archipelago that Canada claims as internal waters while the United States insists is an international strait, becomes potentially vulnerable to more aggressive American assertions backed by implicit or explicit force. Arctic resources including oil, natural gas, and rare earth minerals that lie beneath Canadian territory could become subjects of American strategic interest. Northern territorial claims, including disputed maritime boundaries and continental shelf extensions that Canada has submitted to international bodies, all become potentially vulnerable to similar American pressure if the principle is established that strategic value overrides sovereignty. European allies face precisely the same calculation, though with different geographic specifics. If territorial sovereignty is negotiable based on strategic value rather than absolute, no NATO member can be certain their borders are secure from American demands should the United States decide that a particular piece of Allied territory serves American interests. This fundamentally undermines the collective security guarantee that forms the basis of the alliance. Poland might worry about American demands regarding military bases. Norway might face pressure over Svalbard. The precedent, once established, becomes impossible to contain. According to research from the Danish Institute for International Studies, while Russia and China have indeed increased naval activity in the Arctic region over the past decade, these vessels aren't within visual range of Greenland as Trump claimed when justifying his annexation position. Russian naval expansion has focused primarily on its own northern coast and the Northern Sea route along Siberia. Chinese research vessels and icebreakers have increased their Arctic presence, but their activities remain limited and primarily scientific rather than military. The security justification for annexation, that Greenland faces imminent threat requiring American control, is being openly questioned and contradicted by allied research institutions, military experts, and defense analysts who specialize in Arctic security. None of this means an immediate crisis is inevitable or that the alliance will collapse in the coming weeks. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has announced plans to meet with Danish and Greenlandic officials to discuss the situation, signaling that diplomatic channels remain open and that the administration may be seeking ways to de-escalate the tensions its own rhetoric created. These meetings could provide opportunities for clarification, reassurance, or face-saving retreats from the most extreme positions. But the diplomatic damage is already done and cannot be entirely undone through subsequent meetings. NATO allies have publicly stated, through coordinated joint statements representing multiple governments, that they won't support American territorial claims against another ally. They've backed that opposition with concrete diplomatic actions including new consular missions, cabinet-level delegations, and public affirmations of sovereignty principles. Trust, once broken, is far harder to restore than it was to maintain. Even if this particular dispute is resolved, The knowledge that the United States considered military action against an ally will shape future calculations and relationships in ways that may not become fully apparent for years. Stay with me for the broader implications beyond this single dispute. The core principle at stake is whether territorial sovereignty depends on international law or on military power. Canada's position, shared with European NATO allies, is clear. Sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected in accordance with international law. The significance isn't just about Greenland. It's about whether the post-World War II international order, built on principles like territorial integrity and self-determination, still holds when powerful nations find those principles inconvenient. Danish Prime Minister Frederiksen warned that American military action against Greenland would end NATO. That's not hyperbole. It's a statement that the alliance cannot survive if members attack each other. Canada's choice to explicitly support Denmark, announce concrete diplomatic actions, and coordinate with European allies represents a judgment that these principles matter more than deferring to American preferences. The moral here isn't about any individual leader or administration. It's about what happens when long-standing alliances face tests of their fundamental principles. Alliances work when members trust each other to respect basic rules. When that trust breaks down, allies start making contingency plans that don't assume American reliability. 7 European leaders stated they will not stop defending the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the inviolability of borders. That's a statement of where the lines are. And Canada just made clear it's standing on the same side of those lines as Denmark and Europe. If you want more analysis that explains the context behind the headlines, subscribe to stay informed on the developments that actually shape international relationships. This story isn't over, and understanding the diplomatic dynamics at play matters for grasping what comes next in Arctic geopolitics and NATO coordination.